The moment I stepped through that mahogany door, I knew I had made either the best decision of my life or the worst mistake imaginable. Patricia Whitmore's face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace, like she had just bitten into a lemon while trying to pose for a photograph. Her eyes traveled slowly downward. My simple navy dress, my modest flats, my drugstore earrings. I watched her mentally calculate my net worth and find me worthless. She leaned toward her son, my fiancé, Marcus, and whispered something she clearly thought I couldn't hear, but I heard every single word. She said I looked like the help who had wandered in through the wrong entrance, and that's when I knew this dinner was going to be very, very interesting. My name is Ella Graham. I'm 32 years old, and I have a confession to make. For the past 14 months, I've been keeping a secret from the man I was supposed to marry. Not a small secret like eating the last slice of pizza and blaming it on the dog. Not a medium secret like the fact that I still sleep with a stuffed animal from childhood. No, my secret was that I make $37,000 a month. Before taxes, it's even more obscene. After taxes, it's still the kind of number that makes accountants do a double take and quietly ask if there's been some kind of mistake. I'm a senior software architect at one of the largest tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. I've been writing code since I was 15, sold my first app at 22, and I've been climbing steadily ever since. I hold 3 patents. I've spoken at international conferences. I have stock options that would make your eyes water. And Marcus thought I was an administrative assistant who could barely afford her rent. I never actually lied to him. When we met at a coffee shop 14 months ago, he asked what I did, and I said I worked in tech. He nodded like he understood, then asked if I handled the scheduling for the executives. I smiled, said something vague about supporting the team. He filled in the blanks himself, and I just never corrected him. Why would I do something like that? Why would I let the man I was dating, the man I was genuinely falling in love with, believe I was struggling financially when I could have bought his car 10 times over? Because I learned something a very long time ago from the most important person in my life. My grandmother raised me after my parents passed when I was 7. She lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, drove an older car, shopped at regular grocery stores, never wore anything flashy. She taught me to cook simple meals, to appreciate small pleasures, and to never ever measure my worth by the number in my bank account. What I didn't know until she passed, when I was 24, was that my grandmother was worth several $1,000,000. She had built a small business empire in her youth, invested wisely, and chosen to live simply because she genuinely believed that character was more important than appearance. She left me everything, along with a letter that I still keep in my nightstand. In that letter, she wrote something I have never forgotten. She said, "A person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching, when they believe you have nothing to offer them, when they think you're beneath their notice. That's when you see who they really are." So when Marcus invited me to dinner at his parents' estate, when he hinted that this might be the night things got serious, when he mentioned, almost in passing, that his mother was very particular about first impressions, I made a decision. I would give the Whitmore family the test my grandmother had taught me. I would show up as the simple, unassuming woman they expected. I would wear modest clothes, drive my old car, speak humbly about my circumstances, and I would watch. I would watch how they treated someone they thought couldn't help them, someone they thought was beneath them, someone they thought had absolutely nothing to offer. And before you judge me, before you think I was being manipulative or deceptive, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what your partner's family really thinks of you? Have you ever had that quiet, nagging feeling that the smiles are fake and the compliments are hollow? Have you ever wanted to know the truth, even if it might hurt? I wanted to know. I needed to know, because I wasn't just considering marrying Marcus. I was considering marrying into his family. And families, as my grandmother also taught me, are forever. Now, before I go on with this story, I just want to take a quick moment. If you're enjoying this so far, would you please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love reading those comments. Seeing people from all over the world tuning in at all hours. It means more to me than you know. Okay, back to the story. The Whitmore estate was exactly what I expected, and somehow still managed to surprise me with its excess. The driveway alone was longer than some streets I've lived on. The gates were raw iron with gold accents because apparently regular iron wasn't pretentious enough. The lawn was manicured with a kind of precision that suggested someone actually measured each blade of grass with a ruler. As I drove my 12-year-old Subaru Outback up that pristine driveway, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. Simple makeup, hair pulled back in a low ponytail. My grandmother's small gold studs in my ears, the only jewelry I wore. I looked exactly like someone who didn't belong here. Perfect. Marcus met me at the door with a kiss that felt slightly performative, like he was doing it for an audience. His eyes flicked to my dress, my shoes, my lack of accessories, and I saw something in his expression that I had never noticed before. Embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked. I filed that observation away carefully for later. Inside, the house was a monument to new money trying desperately to look like old money. Crystal chandeliers hung from every ceiling. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, though I noticed, on closer inspection, they were prints, not originals. The furniture was expensive but deeply uncomfortable looking, chosen entirely for appearance rather than function. And there, standing in the foyer like a queen surveying her kingdom, was Patricia Whitmore. She was in her early 60s, with a kind of face that had clearly seen several excellent surgeons. Her blonde hair was styled in a perfect helmet that probably required industrial-strength hairspray to maintain. Her dress was designer, her jewelry was real, and her smile was absolutely completely fake. She extended her hand to me like she was granting an audience. I shook it and felt the limpness, the dismissal, the complete and total absence of warmth. Then she made that comment to Marcus, the one about me looking like the help, and I smiled pleasantly and pretended I hadn't heard a single word. The evening was about to get very interesting indeed. If I had known what I was truly walking into that night, I might have worn armor instead of a navy dress. But then again, I have always believed that the best armor is information. And I had done my research. The Whitmore family owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. Not the flashy luxury brands you see in movies, respectable mid-range vehicles that appealed to regular families. Marcus's father, Harold, had inherited the business from his own father and spent the last 30 years expanding it. Patricia had married into the family at 23 and had immediately set about climbing the social ladder with the determination of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. They had 2 children. Marcus, my fiancé, was 34. He worked as a marketing manager at a company that had nothing to do with the family business. This was apparently a significant sore point with Harold, who had expected his son to take over the dealerships. And then there was Vivian, the older sister, 38 years old, and she treated the family fortune like her personal piggy bank. I had found all of this through public records, social media, and a few well-placed Google searches. I had seen photos of lavish parties, society events, and charity galas. I had read articles about Patricia's philanthropy, though a closer look revealed that most of her donations came with significant tax benefits and carefully managed publicity opportunities. None of it had prepared me for meeting Vivian in person. She arrived 20 minutes late, which I would later learn was her signature move. Making an entrance was apparently more important than respecting other people's time. She swept into the living room wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, with diamonds dripping from her ears and neck, like she had fallen headfirst into a jewelry store and come out covered in merchandise. Her greeting to me was a single word, delivered with the warmth of a frozen fish. "Hello." Not "hello, nice to meet you." Not "hello, Marcus has told us so much about you." "Hello," with a slight curl of the lip that suggested she had smelled something unpleasant. I smiled and said hello back. She immediately turned to her mother and began a conversation that pointedly, deliberately excluded me discussing some charity event and whether the florist had been fired yet for last month's debacle. I stood there holding the glass of water I had been offered, feeling about as welcome as a vegetarian at a steakhouse. Marcus hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable, saying nothing. That was the second observation I filed away. Harold Whitmore was a different creature altogether. He was a large man, the kind who had probably been athletic in his youth, but had since surrendered comfortably to the rewards of wealth. He shook my hand with a grip that was meant to be impressive but just felt tired. His eyes were shrewd, though, and I noticed him watching me with something that might have been genuine curiosity. There was one more guest at the dinner that I hadn't expected, an older gentleman named Richard Hartley, introduced as an old family friend and business associate. He was in his late 60s, silver hair, sharp eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. When he shook my hand, his gaze lingered on my face with a flicker of something I could only describe as recognition. That confused me. Did I know him? Had we met somewhere before? I couldn't place him. And he didn't say anything. But throughout the entire evening, I would keep catching him staring at me with that same quietly puzzled expression. Patricia led us into the dining room, which had been decorated as if someone had been given an unlimited budget and absolutely zero taste. The table was long enough to host a royal banquet. The chairs were upholstered in what I assumed was real silk, and the place settings included more forks than I had ever seen outside of a restaurant supply catalog. I counted them. 6 forks at each place setting. 6 for a single meal. I have seen surgeries performed with fewer instruments. Patricia noticed me looking at the silverware and smiled that frozen smile of hers. "I suppose you're not accustomed to formal dining," she said, her voice dripping with what was meant to sound like sympathy. "My grandmother always taught me," I replied pleasantly, "that it's not the forks that matter, but the company you share the meal with." Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Vivian snorted quietly into her wineglass, and dinner began. The first course was some kind of soup. I couldn't quite identify, but that probably cost more per bowl than my weekly grocery budget. Patricia used this time to begin what I would later think of simply as the interrogation. She asked where I had grown up. I said a small town in Oregon, which was true. She asked about my family. I said my grandmother had raised me, which was also true. She asked what my parents did. I said they had passed when I was very young. Patricia made a sound that was supposed to be sympathetic, but came out sounding like a drain unclogging. "How difficult that must have been," she said, "growing up without proper guidance." "My grandmother," I said quietly, "provided all the guidance I ever needed." Vivian leaned forward then, her diamonds catching the chandelier light. "What did your grandmother do for a living?" "She was a businesswoman," I said. Vivian's eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of business?" "Small ventures. Nothing too exciting. The truth, of course, was that my grandmother had built a company she eventually sold for several $1,000,000, but that wasn't the kind of truth that would serve my purpose tonight." Patricia moved smoothly to the next topic. "And your current job? You work in tech, Marcus mentioned?" "Yes." "Are you a secretary?" "More of a support role," I said. "Patricia, nodded knowingly, the nod of someone whose assumptions had just been confirmed. "That's nice," she said graciously. "Every teen needs support staff." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but still said nothing. And that was when Vivian decided to bring up Alexandra. Alexandra. The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into perfectly still water, sending quiet ripples across the entire table. Vivian said it so casually, as if she was simply mentioning the weather or commenting on the quality of the soup. She had run into Alexandra last week, she said. Alexandra was doing wonderfully. Her family's business was absolutely thriving. I watched Marcus's face carefully. Something flickered there, quickly hidden, but I saw it, and I filed that one away too. Guilt, nervousness, whatever it was that flickered across Marcus's face, it was gone before I could name it. Patricia picked up the thread with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting all evening for exactly this moment. Alexandra, she said, had always been such a lovely girl, so accomplished, so perfectly suited to their family's lifestyle. She had been Marcus's girlfriend for 3 years. Did I know that? I said I didn't. Patricia smiled. Such a shame when they parted ways. Everyone had expected them to end up together. She paused just long enough for the words to land. Alexandra's family owns an import company that deals in luxury vehicles. It would have been such a perfect match for the Whitmore dealerships. The implication was clear as glass. Alexandra had been the right choice. I was not. I glanced around the dining room and noticed for the first time that there were photographs on the wall behind me. I turned slightly in my chair. A gallery of family moments. Christmases, birthdays, graduations, and in at least 4 of those photographs, a beautiful dark-haired woman stood next to Marcus, her arm linked through his, her smile radiant. Alexandra. Patricia followed my gaze and said nothing, but her satisfaction was almost palpable. Vivian twisted the knife a little deeper. Alexandra was still single, she mentioned casually. Such a surprise that no one had snatched her up yet, almost like she was waiting for something, or someone. I turned back to the table and smiled. She sounds like a remarkable woman, I said. This was clearly not the response Vivian had expected. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Patricia recovered first. Yes, Alexandra is quite remarkable. And then with the subtlety of a sledgehammer she added, I do hope you won't feel too out of place in our world, given your more modest background. I paused. What do you mean by modest? Patricia's smile grew teeth. I simply mean that not everyone is born into certain advantages. Some people work ordinary jobs and live ordinary lives. There's no shame in being common. She had called me common. I felt something shift inside me, but I kept my expression perfectly, carefully neutral. I had come here to learn the truth about these people, and the truth was becoming very clear indeed. Marcus finally spoke up. He said his mother didn't mean anything by it, that she was just being protective of him. Patricia patted his hand warmly. Of course I am. A mother always wants the best for her son. The unspoken conclusion hung in the air like smoke. And you are not the best. Harold cleared his throat and made a gentle attempt to change the subject. He asked about my hobbies, whether I had any interests outside of work. I enjoy reading, I said, hiking, cooking simple meals, nothing fancy. Vivian laughed. The way you laugh at a child listing their favorite activities. How adorable, she said. Richard, the family friend, spoke for the first time since we had sat down. I think there's something to be said for simple pleasures, he said quietly. My own grandmother lived a very modest life. She was the happiest person I ever knew. Patricia shot him a look that could have curdled milk. Richard ignored her completely. He continued watching me with that same strange, searching expression. "What was your grandmother's name?" he asked. "Margaret Graham," I said. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. He said nothing more, just nodded thoughtfully, and returned his attention to his soup. The rest of dinner continued in much the same way. Patricia and Vivian took turns asking questions carefully designed to remind me of my place, which, in their minds, was somewhere far beneath them. Marcus made occasional weak attempts to defend me, but his heart clearly wasn't in any of them. Harold stayed mostly silent, watching the proceedings with the tired resignation of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with his wife was simply pointless. And through all of it, Richard watched me. By the time dessert arrived, I had learned everything I needed to know about the Whitmore family. They were snobs of the highest order, the kind who measured human worth entirely in dollars and social connections. They saw me as an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a mistake Marcus had made that needed correcting. But I had also learned something else, something I hadn't expected. Marcus was not the man I had thought he was. The Marcus I had fallen in love with was kind and attentive, genuinely interested in me as a person. But this Marcus, the one sitting at his mother's table, letting her tear me apart without a single word of real protest, was someone different, someone weaker, someone who cared more about his family's approval than about defending the woman he claimed to love. I wondered which one was the real Marcus. I was about to find out. After dessert, Patricia announced that we would have coffee in the sitting room. The men drifted toward the windows to discuss business. Vivian excused herself to make a phone call. Patricia said she needed a word with the housekeeper and would join us shortly. This left me alone, with my thoughts, and a perfect opportunity. I excused myself to find the bathroom. Marcus pointed me toward the back of the house down a long hallway lined with more pretentious artwork. I walked slowly, taking in the details. The house was impressive from a purely financial standpoint, but it felt cold, empty, like a museum that no one actually lived in. The bathroom was easy to find, but I wasn't really looking for it. What I was looking for was understanding, some thread that would help me make sense of the evening. What I found was something much better. As I walked past a partially open door, I heard voices, Patricia's voice and Vivian's. I stopped. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to respect their privacy, to not eavesdrop like a character in a soap opera. But something in Patricia's tone made me pause, something sharp, urgent. I moved closer to the door and stayed in the shadows. Patricia was saying they needed to deal with this situation quickly, that Marcus couldn't be allowed to make this mistake. Vivian agreed. She said she couldn't believe he had actually brought her here, that she had assumed this was just a phase, like his vegetarian period in college. Patricia said this was more serious than a diet. This woman could ruin everything. I felt my heart beating faster. They were talking about me. Of course they were talking about me. But what came next was what made my blood run cold. Vivian said the timing couldn't be worse. They needed the merger with the Castellano family to go through, and Marcus needed to be with Alexandra for that to happen. Castellano. That was Alexandra's family name, the luxury car importers. Patricia agreed. The dealership was in trouble. They needed the Castellano partnership to survive the next fiscal year. I felt the floor shift beneath me. The Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble. I had suspected something from my research, but this confirmed it. Vivian continued. Marcus was supposed to keep Alexandra interested while they worked out the details. That was the plan. Alexandra's family would invest in the dealerships, and in return, they would gain access to the Whitmore distribution network. Patricia added that Marcus had assured her he was keeping his options open with Alexandra. Options open. While he was proposing to me, I leaned against the wall in that dark hallway, my mind racing. This wasn't just snobbery. This wasn't just a family that didn't like their son's girlfriend. This was calculated, strategic. Marcus wasn't just a weak man who couldn't stand up to his mother. Marcus was using me, but for what? Why keep me around if Alexandra was always the plan? Vivian answered my unspoken question. She said Marcus was such a fool. He actually seemed to like this little secretary, this nobody. He was supposed to use her as a placeholder until the deal with Alexandra was finalized, but he was getting attached. A placeholder. That's what I was. A placeholder. A distraction. Someone to keep Marcus occupied while the family quietly worked out their business arrangements. Patricia said they would handle it. They would make the engagement announcement tonight. Get Marcus publicly committed to this girl, and then find a way to break them up before any wedding could happen. Once they had Alexandra secured, they would discover some terrible secret about me that would justify ending the engagement. Vivian asked what terrible secret. Patricia said they would invent one if necessary. I stood in that hallway, frozen, listening to two women plan the complete destruction of my relationship, like they were casually planning a dinner party. And then Vivian said something that made everything even worse. She said at least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything, that Marcus had picked well in that regard. She was naive, trusting, probably just grateful that someone like Marcus had noticed her at all. Patricia laughed and agreed. I stepped back from the door, moving silently down the hallway. My hands were shaking, but not with hurt, with anger. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was naive. They thought I was so desperate for love that I would accept whatever crumbs they threw my way. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I found the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not broken. She was not devastated. She was thinking. I had come here tonight to test Marcus's family, and they had failed, spectacularly. But the test had revealed something I hadn't expected. Marcus himself was part of the problem. He wasn't just caught between me and his family. He was actively deceiving me. The question now was what to do about it. I could confront him, walk out there right now and tell everyone exactly what I had heard, create a scene, expose their plans, and leave this house forever. But that would be too easy, too quick. They would dismiss me as emotional, dramatic, bitter. They would tell themselves I was simply proving their point about me. No, if I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it my way, on my terms, with a plan they would never see coming. My grandmother had taught me many things in her life, but one lesson stood above all the others. She said that when someone underestimates you, they have given you a gift, the gift of surprise. Patricia and Vivian had just handed me the greatest gift of all. They had no idea what I was capable of. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and walked back to the sitting room with a smile on my face. The game was just beginning. When I returned to the sitting room, something had changed. The furniture had been rearranged slightly. The lighting adjusted. Patricia was standing by the fireplace with a look of barely concealed anticipation. Harold had positioned himself near the doorway, looking uncomfortable. Vivian was pretending to examine a painting, but I caught her glancing at Marcus with a smirk, and Marcus was standing in the center of the room, looking nervous, too nervous. He turned when I entered, and his face broke into what was supposed to be a loving smile. He walked toward me, took my hands in his, and said he wanted to ask me something. I felt the trap closing. Marcus said he knew they hadn't been together very long. He knew his family could be a little overwhelming at first, but he said he knew what he wanted. He wanted me. And then he got down on one knee. The ring he produced was large and flashy, exactly the kind of thing Patricia would approve of. It was also, I noticed immediately, of questionable quality. The diamond was cloudy, the setting uneven. The kind of ring that looked impressive in dim lighting, but would reveal its flaws in the harsh light of day, much like the man holding it. Marcus asked me to marry him. Behind him, Patricia was beaming. This was clearly the plan. The first step in their strategy. Get Marcus publicly committed to me, then find a way to dispose of me later. In the meantime, use the engagement to keep Alexandra waiting, dangling the promise of Marcus while they worked out their business arrangements. I understood all of this in the space of a single heartbeat. I also understood that I had a choice to make. I could say no, reject this proposal from a man who was using me in front of a family that despised me, walk out with my dignity intact, and never see any of them again. But that would end the story too soon. I thought about what I had heard in that hallway. I thought about their plans to invent a scandal about me. I thought about how they saw me stupid, naive, disposable, and I thought about how deeply, profoundly satisfying it would be to show them exactly how wrong they were. So I said yes. Marcus slipped the ring on my finger. Patricia began clapping like she was at a theater performance. Vivian offered her congratulations with all the warmth of a January morning in Alaska. Harold shook Marcus's hand and told him he had done well. And Richard caught my eye from across the room. There was something in his expression, something knowing, like a man who suspected this story had a few more chapters yet to be written. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and false congratulations. Patricia talked about engagement party planning. Vivian discussed venues. Harold mentioned business opportunities that might arise from the union of our families, though he stumbled noticeably, clearly unsure what my family could possibly bring to the table. Marcus stayed close to me all evening, playing the devoted fiancé with surprising conviction. If I hadn't heard what his mother and sister had said in that hallway, I might have believed him, but I had heard, and I would never forget. When the evening finally ended, Marcus walked me to my car. The night air was cold and clear. For a moment, we just stood there in that long, pristine driveway, looking at each other. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I know my family can be a lot, but they'll warm up to you. I promise." "I understand," I said. "I'm just tired." He kissed me good night, and I drove away from the Whitmore estate with his ring on my finger and a plan forming quietly in my mind. The next morning, I started my research. If there is one thing my work has taught me above everything else, it is the power of information, data, documentation. I spend my days analyzing systems, finding weaknesses, optimizing solutions. I was about to apply those exact same skills to the Whitmore family. What I found over the next few days confirmed everything I had heard, and then some. The Whitmore dealerships were indeed in serious financial trouble, not just a rough patch structural problems. They had expanded too quickly during the boom years, taken on far too much debt, and now the bills were coming due. Their main franchise agreement was up for renewal, and the manufacturer was already looking at other options. The partnership with Alexandra's family wasn't just strategic, it was desperate. But that wasn't all. As I dug deeper, I found something else, something the Whitmores had clearly believed was hidden forever. Vivian had been embezzling from the family business. The amounts were small at first, hidden carefully in expense reports and petty cash accounts, but over the years, they had added up. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, quietly siphoned off to fund her lifestyle while the company struggled to stay afloat. I printed out everything I found: legal documents, financial statements, records of suspicious transactions, and then I started making phone calls. My grandmother's name still carried genuine weight in certain circles. The business contacts she had cultivated over decades remembered the Graham family with real respect. When I reached out, they were happy to talk. One of those contacts happened to know Richard Hartley, and Richard, it turned out, had his own history with the Whitmore family. They had cheated him on a business deal years ago. Nothing criminal, just unethical enough to leave a very bitter taste. He had been quietly waiting for an opportunity to even the score. I was about to give him that opportunity. Before we continue, I just want to say something from my heart. This channel means so much to me, and every like, every comment, every subscription helps more than you know. If you're enjoying this story, would you take just 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button? It truly makes a difference. Thank you. Now, back to what happened next. The next few weeks were an exercise in patience and performance. I played the role of the happy fiancé with the skill of an award-winning actress. I attended family dinners at the Whitmore estate, listened to Patricia's passive-aggressive comments with a serene smile, watched Vivian flaunt her designer clothes and expensive jewelry, knowing exactly where that money had come from, and I watched Marcus. He was different now. Or maybe I was simply seeing him clearly for the first time. The attentiveness I had once found charming now seemed calculated. The compliments felt rehearsed, and his phone, which he guarded with increasing vigilance, buzzed constantly with messages he quickly hid from view. I knew who was texting him. I had seen the name flash across his screen more than once. Alexandra. One evening I told Marcus I was working late. Instead, I parked near the restaurant where he was supposedly meeting a client. He wasn't meeting a client. He was meeting her. I watched through the window as they sat together at a corner table, their heads close, their body language unmistakably, painfully intimate. At one point, he took her hand across the table. At another, she laughed at something he said and touched his face. I took photographs. Not because I needed evidence for any legal purpose, but because I wanted to remember this moment. I wanted to remember exactly how clearly I had finally learned to see. I wanted to remember exactly who Marcus Whitmore really was. He wasn't just weak. He wasn't just a mama's boy. He was a liar and a cheat, actively maintaining 2 relationships while his family orchestrated the outcome from behind the scenes. The rage I felt in that moment was white-hot and purifying, but I didn't act on it. Not yet. Instead, I went home and added the photographs to my growing file. Richard and I had been meeting regularly by then, always in secret. He had his own documentation of the Whitmore family's questionable business practices. He knew people who had been hurt by their dealings over the years, and he was more than willing to help bring the truth to light. But one evening, he asked me something that stopped me cold. He said he understood his own motivations, but he wanted to know mine. Was this just about revenge, or was it something more? I thought about his question for a long time before I answered. It's not about revenge, I said finally. It's about truth. I said the Whitmores had spent their entire lives using their money and their position to manipulate people. They treated anyone they deemed beneath them as completely disposable. They were raising Marcus to be exactly the same way, and they would keep doing it to others long after I was gone. Someone needs to show them, I said, that their money cannot protect them from consequences. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Your grandmother, he said softly, would be proud. That was the moment I knew. I had made the right choice. The engagement party was set for 3 weeks later. The Whitmores were hosting it at their estate, inviting everyone who mattered in the local business community. Patricia was treating it like a coronation, an opportunity to show off her perfect family to the world. She had no idea what was coming. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. I coordinated with Richard. I made strategic calls to industry contacts. I even reached out to the car manufacturer that was considering dropping the Whitmore dealerships. They were very interested in what I had to share. And then the night before the party, I did one last thing. I gave Marcus one final chance to be honest. We were sitting in his apartment going over last-minute details for the party. I asked him casually how he felt about us, about our future. He said he was excited. He said he couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me. Anything at all. He looked at me with those blue eyes I had once found so charming. He said there was nothing. He said I was everything he had ever wanted. I asked about Alexandra. His face went pale. He recovered quickly, but I had already seen the flash of fear in his eyes. He said Alexandra was just an old friend, nothing more. I nodded and said I understood. And in that moment, I truly did. I understood that Marcus would never tell me the truth. He would lie to my face for as long as it served his purposes. He was his mother's son, through and through. The next evening, I opened my real closet. Not the modest navy dress I had worn to that first dinner, not the carefully chosen costume of someone who didn't belong. What I put on tonight was designer, elegant, worth more than everything Patricia Whitmore was wearing combined. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. It was time to show the Whitmore family exactly who they had underestimated. The Whitmore estate had been transformed. White tents dotted the manicured lawn. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures, casting prismatic light across the gathering crowd. A string quartet played tasteful classical music near the fountain. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than some people's hourly wage. Patricia had truly outdone herself. This wasn't just a party. This was a statement. I pulled up in my usual Subaru, watching the valet's expressions as they tried to reconcile my modest car with the parade of Mercedes and BMWs that had preceded it. One of them actually asked if I was with the catering company. I smiled and handed him my keys. The walk from the parking area to the main tent felt like a runway. With every step, I shed the persona I had been carefully wearing for the past 3 weeks. The nervous girlfriend, the grateful fiancé, the simple woman who should be thankful for Patricia Whitmore's grudging acceptance. Tonight, I was Ella Graham, the real one. My dress was deep emerald green custom-fitted by a designer whose name was whispered in fashion circles with genuine reverence. My jewelry was understated, but unmistakable to anyone who truly knew quality. My grandmother's diamond pendant hung at my throat, a piece that had been appraised at more than most cars cost. My watch was a limited edition. Only 50 people in the world owned one. I had spent 14 months hiding who I was. Tonight, I would stop hiding. The first person to notice me was a woman I didn't recognize, someone's wife or girlfriend, standing near the entrance to the main tent. She looked at me, did a double take, and then whispered something quickly to her companion. They both stared. I kept walking. The second person to notice was Harold Whitmore himself. He was greeting guests near the bar, performing his duties as host with the tired enthusiasm of a man who would rather be watching golf. When he saw me, his welcoming smile simply froze. His eyes traveled from my face to my dress to my jewelry and back again, and I watched confusion replace his practiced hospitality in real time. I said good evening, and thanked him for hosting such a lovely party. He stammered something about being glad I could make it, his eyes still trying, and failing, to solve the puzzle I presented. I moved on before he could find any questions. The main tent was filled with perhaps 100 guests, a carefully curated collection of business associates, society figures, and family friends. I recognized several faces from my research: the regional manager from the car manufacturer, several competing dealership owners, a journalist from the local business publication, and there, holding court near the champagne fountain, was Patricia Whitmore. She was wearing a cream-colored gown that had probably cost a small fortune, though it was clearly off the rack despite her best efforts to suggest otherwise. Her jewelry was impressive by normal standards, but unremarkable by the standards of true wealth. She was laughing at something one of her guests had said, her head thrown back in that practiced way that suggested she had learned to fake amusement sometime around finishing school. She hadn't seen me yet. I collected a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and made my way through the crowd, stopping to introduce myself to several guests along the way. Each interaction followed the same quiet pattern: confusion at my appearance, surprise when I mentioned I was Marcus's fiancé, renewed confusion when my dress, my jewelry, my manner didn't match whatever they had been told about me. Word was spreading. I could see it in the whispers, the sidelong glances, the phones being subtly checked as people tried to figure out who I really was. Good. I finally reached Patricia's circle just as she was finishing a story about her recent charity work. She turned to greet the newcomer with her standard frozen smile, and then her face went through a remarkable transformation. First confusion, then recognition, then disbelief, then something that might have been fear. "Ella?" she said, my name like a question. "Good evening, Patricia," I said warmly. "Thank you for throwing such a beautiful party." Her eyes were moving rapidly, taking in every detail: the dress that cost more than her monthly household budget, the pendant that had been featured in a jewelry magazine, the watch she had probably never seen outside of an advertisement. "Where did you get these things?" Her voice was carefully controlled, but unable to hide the slight tremor beneath it. "Just a few pieces I had been saving for a special occasion," I said pleasantly. Vivian appeared at her mother's side. Summoned by some invisible distress signal, she looked at me and her expression went through the same journey Patricia's had: confusion, recognition, disbelief. But Vivian recovered faster. "Interesting dress," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Is it a rental?" I told her the designer's name. I said he was a friend who had made it specifically for me. The designer's name hit Vivian like a physical blow. This was someone who dressed celebrities, who had a waiting list years long, who absolutely did not make dresses for administrative assistants who could barely afford their rent. She opened her mouth to respond. Nothing came out. I excused myself to find Marcus. As I walked away, I heard Patricia hiss something urgent to Vivian about finding out what was going on, and Vivian's confused reply that she had no idea, that this didn't make any sense. I smiled to myself and kept walking. The first phase of the evening was complete. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now it was time to let it grow. Marcus found me before I found him. He emerged from a cluster of guests near the bar, his face pale, his eyes wide. He had clearly heard the whispers, seen the looks, tried and failed to reconcile the woman standing before him with the woman he thought he knew. "What is going on?" he asked. "Where did you get the dress? The jewelry? Why do you look like a completely different person?" "I look like myself," I said simply. He stared at me, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, not understanding exactly, more like the first hairline crack in a wall that had been hiding an uncomfortable truth. "Can we talk privately?" "Later," I said. "This is our engagement party, Marcus. We have guests to attend to." Before he could protest, I took his arm and steered him toward a group of business associates. These were the men and women who ran the automotive industry in our region, the people whose opinions actually mattered to the Whitmore dealership's survival. They had been watching my entrance with undisguised curiosity. I introduced myself properly this time. My full name, Ella Graham, my position at my company. I watched their expressions shift as they recognized the company name, as they realized who I actually was. One of them, a silver-haired man who ran a competing dealership chain, said he had heard of me. His nephew worked in tech, and had mentioned my name in connection with some innovative software solutions. I thanked him sincerely. Another guest, a woman who handled mergers and acquisitions for a major investment firm, asked if I was related to Margaret Graham. I said she was my grandmother. The woman's eyebrows rose. "Your grandmother was a remarkable businesswoman," she said. "The Graham name still carries significant weight in certain financial circles." I could feel Marcus tensing beside me. He had no idea what any of this meant. He had never asked about my family beyond the most superficial questions. He had assumed poor meant unimportant, and he had never once bothered to look deeper. His mistake. The evening continued, and with each conversation the truth spread a little further. People were talking, checking their phones, confirming details quietly with each other. The narrative was shifting beneath the Whitmore's feet, and they didn't know how to stop it. Richard arrived about an hour into the party. He found me near the rose garden momentarily alone, while Marcus had been pulled away by his father for some urgent conversation. Richard said the manufacturer's representative was here, that the man had been very interested in the documentation Richard had shared with him earlier in the week. "Are you ready?" I asked. Richard looked at me with those steady, sharp eyes. "I've been ready for years," he said. We spoke for a few more minutes, finalizing the details of what would happen next. Then Richard melted quietly back into the crowd, and I returned to my role as the happy fiancé. Patricia found me next. She had regained some of her composure, though I could clearly see the strain around her eyes, the tightness at her jaw. She pulled me aside with a grip that was stronger than necessary, and demanded to know what I was doing. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You know what I mean," she said, her voice low and sharp. "The dress, the jewelry, the stories you've been telling people about your grandmother and your job. What is your game?" "There is no game," I said calmly. "I'm simply being myself." "That is impossible." Her voice was rising slightly. "Marcus told me about your circumstances. You're a secretary. You live in a studio apartment. You drive a car that belongs in a junkyard." "Marcus made certain assumptions," I said. "I never actually told him those things." Patricia's face went very still. "I said I worked in tech," I continued, which was true. I said I had a support role, which is also true, since architects support the development teams. I never once claimed to be poor. I simply never corrected the assumptions that were made. "Why?" I looked at her directly. "My grandmother taught me that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching, when they believe you have nothing to offer them, when they think you're beneath their notice." I paused. I wanted to know who the Whitmore family really was. Patricia's face drained of color. "Now," I said quietly, "I know." Before she could respond, the string quartet stopped playing. Harold Whitmore's voice came over the speaker system announcing that it was time for the official toasts and speeches. Patricia looked at me with something I recognized now as genuine fear. I smiled and walked toward the stage. The main event was about to begin. The stage had been set up at the far end of the main tent, decorated with flowers and soft, warm lighting that was probably designed to feel romantic, but tonight felt more like a spotlight waiting for its moment. Harold stood at the microphone, welcoming guests and thanking them for coming to celebrate this special occasion. He talked about family, about tradition, about the importance of strong partnerships in both business and life. His eyes kept darting to Patricia, who was making her way through the crowd toward the stage with the steady, focused determination of a general approaching a battlefield. She reached the microphone just as Patricia took over the microphone smoothly, her composure firmly back in place, her smile as frozen and perfect as ever. She said she was so pleased to welcome everyone to this celebration of her son's engagement. She said Marcus had found himself a wonderful young woman, someone who would be a perfect addition to the Whitmore family. She talked about exciting plans for the future, plans that would ensure the Whitmore legacy continued for generations to come. Then she began to hint at business opportunities, growth, expansion, new partnerships, strategic alliances. The Whitmore dealerships, she said, were entering an exciting new chapter. I watched the manufacturer's representative shift uncomfortably in the crowd. I saw Richard catch his eye and nod almost imperceptibly. Patricia was building towards something. She was using this engagement party as a platform for a business announcement almost certainly related to the Castellano merger that was supposed to save their company. She called Marcus to the stage. He climbed the steps, looking nervous, though he was doing his best to hide it behind his practiced smile. He stood beside his mother and looked out at the crowd, searching for me. His expression was complicated. Then Patricia said there was one more person who should be on this stage. She wanted to welcome her future daughter-in-law, the woman who had captured her son's heart. She said my name, and the entire crowd turned to look at me. I set down my champagne glass and walked toward the stage. The tent was silent, except for the sound of my footsteps. Every single eye was on me. The whispers had done their work. Everyone in that room understood that something was happening, that this engagement party was about to become something else entirely. I climbed the steps and stood beside Marcus. He reached for my hand, but his grip was uncertain, questioning. Patricia handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you'd like to say a few words," she said graciously. I looked at the microphone in my hand. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Patricia, who genuinely believed she was still in control. I looked out at the crowd, all these people who could make or break the Whitmore family's future. "Yes," I said, "I would like to say a few words." And then I began to speak. I thanked Patricia for the warm welcome she had given me. I said I wanted to acknowledge the Whitmore family for showing me exactly who they were over the past few weeks. Patricia's smile flickered. "When I first came to this house," I said, "I made a decision. I decided to let the Whitmores see a simple version of me, a woman without expensive clothes or impressive credentials, a woman they might consider beneath their notice." The crowd was utterly silent. I wanted to see how they would treat someone they thought couldn't help them, someone they thought had nothing to offer, someone they thought was... I paused. In Patricia's own words, common. Patricia's face went white. I said what I had found was illuminating. I described the dinner where I had been compared unfavorably to Marcus's ex-girlfriend. I described the whispered insults Patricia had assumed I couldn't hear. I described being called the help, being called common, being quietly dismissed by people who knew absolutely nothing about me. Marcus was staring at me now, his face a mask of horror. "And then," I said, "I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear." I described the conversation in the hallway. Patricia and Vivian discussing how to remove me from Marcus's life, learning that I had been brought into this family as a placeholder, someone to keep Marcus occupied while they arranged his real future with Alexandra Castellano. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I said I had discovered that the Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble, that they were desperate for the Castellano merger to survive, that Marcus had been keeping his options open with Alexandra the entire time we had been together. I pulled out my phone and held up a photograph for the room to see. Marcus and Alexandra at the restaurant, hands linked across the table, their faces close, their body language unmistakably intimate. "This was taken 2 weeks ago," I said quietly, "while Marcus was supposedly working late." The crowd erupted. Marcus grabbed my arm. "This isn't what it looks like," he said urgently. "I can explain." "You already explained," I said. "I gave you the chance to be honest last night. You chose to lie." I turned back to the crowd. "There's more." The tent went completely silent again. Every person in that room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The comfortable rules of society events had been suspended. The masks were coming off. I said I had spent the past several weeks researching the Whitmore family business. I mentioned the financial records, the overextended credit, the declining sales, the franchise agreement that was about to be terminated. Harold Whitmore's face had gone gray. I also found evidence of something more serious. I looked directly at Vivian. She was standing near the back of the tent, frozen in place, like a deer caught in headlights. I said Vivian Whitmore had been embezzling from the family company for years. The amounts had started small, hidden carefully in expense reports and petty cash accounts, but over time, they had grown. The total was now in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Vivian's husband turned slowly to look at her, with an expression of pure, undiluted shock. "That is a lie." Vivian's voice rang out through the tent. "I have no proof. You're just a bitter woman trying to destroy our family." Richard stepped forward from the crowd. "I have proof," he said. He walked calmly toward the stage, carrying a folder I knew contained years of careful documentation. Bank records, expense reports, transaction histories. Everything needed to prove exactly what Vivian had done. He handed the folder to the manufacturer's representative, who had moved closer to the stage with the look of a man whose worst suspicions were being confirmed. Richard looked up at the crowd. "I've been waiting a long time for this moment," he said. "The Whitmores cheated me on a business deal 15 years ago. Nothing illegal, just unethical enough to leave a very bitter taste." He paused. When Ella approached me with evidence of their current misdeeds, I was happy to contribute what I knew. Patricia found her voice. "This is outrageous," she said, stepping forward. "You have no right to make these accusations. I will sue you both for defamation." "You are welcome to try," I said calmly. "Everything I have shared tonight is documented and verifiable. The financial records are public information available to anyone who knows where to look. The evidence of Vivian's embezzlement has been compiled from sources that will hold up in any court." I looked at Marcus. He was still standing beside me, looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed around him. "There's one more thing," I said. I reached up and removed the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy diamond caught the chandelier light, revealing all its flaws. I held it out to Marcus. "I will not be marrying Marcus Whitmore." A beat of absolute silence. I never intended to. Not after I learned the truth about him and his family. The only reason I said yes to his proposal was to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I placed the ring in his hand. "Give it to Alexandra," I said. "She is clearly the one you actually wanted." Marcus's face crumpled. "That's not true," he said, his voice breaking. "I have real feelings for you. The thing with Alexandra, it was just business, something my mother arranged. I didn't. That," I said gently, "is exactly the problem. You let your mother arrange your life, your relationships, your future. You never once stood up for me when your family attacked me. You lied to my face about Alexandra, even when I gave you the chance to tell the truth." I looked at him for a long moment. A man who can't be honest with a woman he claims to love is not a man I want to marry. The crowd was completely, utterly silent. I turned to face them one final time. "My name is Ella Graham. I am a senior software architect. I have built my career through hard work and integrity. I make more money in a single month than most people make in a year, and I live simply, because my grandmother taught me that wealth is not the measure of a person's worth." I let that settle for just a moment. The Whitmores showed me their true character. They revealed themselves as people who judge others by their bank accounts and their social status. They treated me with contempt because they believed I had nothing to offer them. I paused. That is the kind of character that will eventually destroy them, with or without my help. I set the microphone down on the podium and walked off the stage. The crowd parted for me like water. No one spoke. No one tried to stop me. Behind me, I heard the chaos begin. Patricia's voice high and desperate, trying to salvage a narrative that had slipped completely, permanently beyond her grasp. She was saying there had been a misunderstanding, that I was clearly disturbed, that none of what I had said was true, but the damage was done. I could hear the manufacturer's representative speaking quietly into his phone, his voice clipped and professional. I could hear other guests murmuring, some already moving toward the exits, wanting to put distance between themselves and the disaster unfolding in that tent. I reached the edge of the tent and paused, just for a moment. Vivian had cornered her husband near the bar, trying to explain, trying to justify. His expression was stone. He was looking at her like he had never truly seen her before, like the woman he had married had been replaced by a stranger wearing her face. Harold was slumped in a chair near the stage, head in his hands. The patriarch of the Whitmore empire, brought low by the exposure of secrets he had probably suspected for years but never wanted to acknowledge. And Marcus was still standing alone on the stage, the rejected ring still clutched in his hand. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Anger, grief, regret. It didn't matter anymore. I walked out of the tent and into the cool, clear night air. The stars were bright overhead, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with air that felt cleaner somehow, lighter. Richard found me by the fountain a few minutes later. "It's done," he said quietly. "The manufacturer already made the call. The Whitmore dealerships will lose their franchise agreement by the end of the month." "Do you feel satisfied?" I asked. He thought about that for a moment. "Satisfaction isn't quite the right word," he said. "It feels more like relief, like a debt that has finally been paid." I understood exactly what he meant. He asked what I would do now. "I'm going to go home," I said. "Sleep well for the first time in weeks. Wake up tomorrow and continue building the life I created for myself. The life that has nothing to do with Marcus Whitmore or his family." Richard nodded slowly. "Your grandmother would have been proud of you tonight." I felt tears prick at my eyes. Unexpected, unwelcome. "I hope so," I said softly. He handed me a business card. He said if I ever needed anything, I should call, that he owed me one. I tucked the card into my purse and thanked him. Then I walked to the valet station, collected my old Subaru from a very confused attendant, and drove away from the Whitmore estate for the very last time. In my rear-view mirror, I could see guests streaming out of the tent, the party dissolving into chaos behind me, Patricia still gesturing wildly, still trying to control a narrative that had slipped completely beyond her grasp. I turned my eyes back to the road and didn't look again. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove through the night, letting the miles put distance between me and everything that had happened. When I finally pulled up to my modest apartment, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. I thought about Marcus, about the man I had believed he was, and the man he had turned out to be, about how close I had come to marrying him, to binding my life to his, to becoming part of a family that would have treated me with contempt forever. I thought about my grandmother and the lesson she had spent her entire life teaching me, and I thought about the future, my future, the one I would build for myself, on my own terms, with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I got out of the car and went inside. My apartment was small, simple, just the way I liked it. I made myself a cup of tea, changed out of the designer dress, and sat by the window in my old comfortable robe. The city lights sparkled below me, thousands of lives playing out in thousands of lit windows. I was just one of them. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, and that was exactly how I wanted it. 1 week later, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline read, "Whitmore Automotive facing closure after franchise termination." I read the article slowly. The manufacturer had officially ended their partnership with the Whitmore dealerships, citing concerns about financial management and ethical practices. Without the franchise agreement, the dealerships couldn't sell new vehicles. Without new vehicle sales, the business couldn't survive. The article mentioned that several former business partners had come forward with their own complaints about the Whitmore family's practices. It mentioned that an internal investigation had revealed financial irregularities now being reviewed by authorities. It mentioned that Vivian Whitmore had been asked to step down from her position in the company pending further inquiry. It did not mention me. I had asked Richard to keep my name out of it, and he had honored that request. The story would be about the Whitmore family's own misdeeds, not about the woman who had exposed them. I didn't want fame. I didn't want recognition. I just wanted the truth to come out, and it had. I finished my coffee and looked around my small, quiet kitchen. The same kitchen I had been sitting in a month ago when I first drove to the Whitmore estate. The same kitchen where I had made the decision to test them, to see who they really were beneath their polished, carefully maintained surface. So much had changed since then, and so much had stayed exactly the same. My phone buzzed again. A text from Marcus. He said he needed to see me. He said he could explain everything. He said he had made mistakes, but he still cared about me. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk. I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I deleted it without responding. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the morning sun rising slowly over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day. A day for new beginnings, for moving forward, for building something better. My grandmother's pendant hung at my throat, warm against my skin. I touched it gently, thinking about the woman who had taught me everything I truly knew about character and worth. She had lived her life simply not because she had to, but because she understood that the things that truly matter cannot be bought. Love, integrity, self-respect, the quiet knowledge that you have acted according to your principles, even when it would have been so much easier to compromise. The Whitmores had believed they could buy their way through life. They had believed that money and status made them better than everyone else, entitled to treat people however they wished without ever facing consequences. They had been wrong. I turned away from the window and got ready for work. My regular job, at my regular company, doing the work I loved with people who respected me for my skills and my character, rather than my bank account. The story of the Whitmore family would continue to unfold in the weeks and months ahead. There would be investigations, legal proceedings, consequences and repercussions. The empire they had built on a foundation of arrogance and calculated deception would crumble piece by piece. But that was their story now, not mine. My story was just beginning, and it would be written on my own terms, in my own words, according to my own values. That was the lesson my grandmother had left me. That was the truth I had carried with me through every moment of the past month. A person's worth is not measured by their bank account, not by their social status, not by the opinions of people like Patricia Whitmore. It's measured by their character, by the choices they make when no one is watching. By the way, they treat people who can't do anything for them. The Whitmores had failed that test, completely, and I had finally found the answer I had been looking for. The answer was that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need Marcus's love. I didn't need anyone's validation to know my own worth. I already knew who I was, and that was enough. The end.